Now what about Peirce? He is obviously the most difficult one for me, and as I say, I've been studying Peirce. My first office at Harvard Observatory was close by the library. I spent a lot of time in the library, and that's where Charles Sanders Peirce worked as an assistant at the observatory. I felt very close to Peirce, lived close to him. I was born in Cambridge and all of that. But he came up with this idea of tychism, real objective chance, getting it from Fourier and Renouvier, but that's all right. He really believed it, gave it a name. Unfortunately for Peirce, he always thought everything had to come in threes. So whereas Darwin had a two-step process of some randomness followed by an evaluation process that's adequately determined, instead, Peirce put it in a kind of Progressian bed of 3 steps. And I don't really need to detail them for you, but unfortunately, Peirce, I summarized some of his important triads as to evolution. He made it into 3 steps, and then he had 3 levels of thought. And I think you'd enjoy reading Hegel on free will, because I think, as we learned this morning, Hegel had a big influence on James, and he had a big influence on Peirce, and maybe the triadomania Peirce described was derived from Hegel. But Hegel actually has a very nice triad I like a lot. He doesn't have James' insight, but he starts with randomness as subjective in the great dialectic of thesis, antithesis. The antithesis is determination by the object in the world, followed by not a synthesis, as English usually simplifies Hegel's thought, but an Aufheben. As Kant earlier had said the same thing, Aufheben is a German word that has the connotation of heave out. You see the Heben is a heave out, but also up. And it really means something, as John was saying the other morning, it transcends. We're looking for something that gets above the either or of indeterminacy and determinacy up to something that transcends them by using both, which is what William James will have done. He said, I've got both chance and I've got over here granting consent to one of the options. So I think you'll like my pages on Hegel, the references to the philosophy of right, and I've got the sections there. Okay, I think I'll jump over Peirce because this is an equivocation. I want to watch my time and give you some time to get at me with questions. So there's a very interesting case of Dickinson Miller. Miller was, as you know, first a student, many of you know, of James, and then later a colleague at Harvard. And then 24 years after James' death, he wrote a mysterious paper called, in here somewhere, Free Will as Involving Determination and Inconceivable Without It, which has been taken as a landmark paper to show that free will requires determinism. Hobart never said determinism. He just said determination. And he never denied, I'm not maintaining, he says in this paper, that determinism is true, but this is a major reference in textbooks on philosophy on why we need determinism. And it's a total mistake, misreading of Hobart, because he was not only Peircean, not only a Jamesian by his friendship and so forth, but look at what he says. 2 courses of action. Actually, James thinks not 2, but a blooming, buzzing confusion of alternatives present themselves. Do we recognize that phrase? This man is speaking William James' ideas without giving him credit. Now, I find it's a hard job to go and research, and when there's no footnotes like we have today, that I got that from William James. But I think that convinces me. I know he's talking James. Okay, let's move on to the first of the people that are not contemporaries or exactly, although James and Poincaré are more or less the same time. Here's the great mathematician speculating on how it is he comes up with new ideas in math. He says he's using random combinations and possibilities are generated, some unconsciously, then they are selected among. Is that the 2-stage solution? Simple as that. Looks just like Darwin. Random combinations, possibilities, some unconsciously, then they're selected among. In the subliminal ego, there reigns what I would call liberty, if one could give this name to the mere absence of discipline and to disorder born of chance. There is Poincaré getting on the same wavelength as William James. Chance is important. And now watch this. It's certain that the combinations which present themselves. Am I reading William James into Poincaré with that same important phrase? Present themselves to the mind in a kind of sudden illumination. After a prolonged period of unconscious work, only a few are harmonious, useful, and beautiful, and they will be capable of affecting the geometrician's special sensibility and will direct our attention. Am I reading William James? They will focus attention. They will grant consent to one of those possibilities, and this will give them the opportunity of becoming conscious. I can actually show you that that idea comes from Renouvier and not just from James, that the way we select is simply by paying our attention to one of the many possibilities in front of us and staying with that idea. So, I think I've been able to find that no one before William James had a two-stage model for free will, and let's turn now to a few since him, although few, if any, a couple give any explicit credit to the immediate predecessors. So I have a research problem to figure out what do they know and what are they not telling us about William James and earlier thinkers, okay? I actually find it very hard to believe that almost any of these who write on free will and determinism wouldn't have read the author of the article that defined the terms hard and soft determinism, which they use, and the iron block universe of determinism and the quagmire of evasion that's compatibilism. You want to stop me for a moment, or you're just exercising? Okay, good. All right, I hope I'll give you time to get at me. Arthur Holly Compton is the first of the scientists in my list. Compton is the Nobel Prize winner for the Compton effect, in which electrons interact with photons in wonderful ways, all a few years after the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg. And he proposed, look, maybe there's a quantum event in the brain which will come up and break the causal chain of determinism. At this point in time, it's 1931, it's Science magazine, and Arthur Holly Compton has gotten us back to Epicurus, who said, maybe the atoms swerve every now and then. Notice it is not a solution. It's just a way to say determinism is false, indeterminism is true, and all the philosophers who argue this logically are making a mistake. Indeterminism is true now because of physics, but it's no answer to the problem of stopping that randomness from contaminating our choice. So, 1955, 24 years later, he saw randomness as producing a range of events. And he's starting to see that he needs to keep the randomness just generating possibilities from which the choice is made. And he uses the phrase, which I love a lot, that first there's chance and then there's choice. Now, Karl Popper, certainly the best known internationally famous philosopher in my group, wrote for many years objecting to Compton and their amplified quantum event, but by 1977, in a book with the great neurobiologist John Eccles, The Self and Its Brain, he began to say this: new ideas have a striking similarity to genetic mutations. Well, we've heard our William James saying that back in the Principles, and in another lecture. They're also probabilistic, not in themselves originally selected or adequate, but on them there subsequently operates natural selection, which, he's really talking about natural selection here, and we could conceive of a similar process with respect to new ideas and to free will decisions. And then he says, the selection of a kind of behavior out of a randomly offered repertoire. There's James' alternative possibilities presenting themselves. He's not using James' terminology. Be an act of free will. I am an indeterminist, he said, although he hadn't been all his life. A choice process may be a selection process, and the selection may be from some repertoire of random events without being random in its turn. Karl Popper sees the randomness does not necessarily make the choice based on our motives, feelings, emotions, whatever, random itself. That was in a Darwin lecture. Now, Henry Margenau, watching my time, I should jump over him, lectured on scientific indeterminism, and he basically said in '82, I have a solution to what heretofore has been seen as an illusion. That's fine, but too bad he hadn't read all the other thinkers I pointed out, starting with James, who said, it's not an illusion. There's really a way to think about this. And the thesis is, quantum mechanics, etc., freedom involves two components, chance, existence of a genuine set of alternatives, and quantum mechanics provides the chance, and we argue that only the mind can make the choice by selecting among the possible ambiguous futures, as James told us there really exist. This is in 1982, sort of late to the game, and he's dead now, but a very important, not just a physicist, but a philosopher of physics. Now Dan Dennett, the guy who in 1978 wrote what I thought was the closest thing to my model. And what does he say? The best thoughts on a two-stage model written by any philosopher. Absolutely. He says, unfortunately, he didn't endorse it. He proposes a decision-making model where first you have consideration generator, whose output is to some degree undetermined, produces considerations, but those considerations ultimately serve as predictors and explicators of the agent's decision. And he then gives 6 terrific reasons. I don't think I have time to go into them particularly, but I want you to show he's diffident. He says, I think the model of mine, he's saying, installs indeterminism in the right place for the libertarian, Bob Kane he was writing about at the time, if there is a right place at all. So Dan Dennett is really deep down one of the great compatibilist determinists and has been defending that for years, and I've been watching him for years, and I'm looking forward to engaging him because he's one of the few people who's going to let me come talk, even in his seminar. Several other excellent reasons. You'll have to go find them there. Here's Bob Kane. He also describes the two-stage model, but he also does not really endorse it. But he likes the idea that it provides an open future, such as we think we have when we exercise free will, and so forth. A little diffident, and that's part, the leading people today write always in a sign of agnostic way, not liking to commit themselves to any position. Al Mealy, another of the great guys who has the grant, he basically admits he's following Dennett's model, which is a sign of decent scholarship, anyway, compared to the others. And he gives a very similar model. I'll take my word for it. Steve Koslin wrote an introduction to a famous book called Mind Time by Benjamin Libet, which is used by neuroscientists to argue we don't have free will. But in the introduction, Koslin writes that, look, we construct rationales and anticipated consequences as appropriate for the specific situation. This construction process may rely in part on chaotic processes. Such processes are not entirely determined by one's learning history or even as filtered by one's genes. And given those choices of rationales and anticipated consequences, one decides what to do on the basis of, read, adequately determined by one's knowledge, one's goals, one's values, and one's beliefs. He's clearly seeing William James. I sent this quote of his to him.